Have you ever imagined being a police officer, and one day at work this happens to you? Here's a true story. My name is Jack Thompson. I've been a police officer for over 15 years in a small town in the interior of the state of Ohio. I've seen a lot in that time. Robberies, domestic violence, chases, missing persons cases. We end up getting a bit hardened, accustomed to the darker side of people. But there was one night, a night that I'll never forget. And it wasn't because of some criminal or dangerous situation. It was something much more than that, something that I still try to understand today. It was an autumn night, one of those when the fog covers the streets like a thick blanket. I was on duty, doing the night patrol with my partner, Mike Harper. Mike and I had worked together for years, and we had a solid friendship. We were used to sharing stories to pass the time, but that night, the silence was almost palpable. The fog, the darkness, everything contributed to a heavy atmosphere. We received a call from a house on the outskirts of town, in an area known for its old, mostly abandoned homes. Most of the houses there were decrepit, forgotten by time, but a few were still inhabited by people who had nowhere else to go. The call said that an elderly woman, Mrs. Eleanor Perkins, had called 911 to say she was hearing strange noises in the house next door to hers. She had lived alone since her husband had passed away, and from what we could tell, the house next door had been vacant for years. We arrived at the scene around 2 a.m. The fog was even thicker in that part of town, making it difficult to see anything more than a few feet away. Mrs. Perkins' house was an old building with peeling paint and cracked windows, but it seemed safe. As we approached the door, we were greeted by a frail woman with a weather-beaten face and fearful eyes. She told us that for the past few weeks, around 3 in the morning, she had heard heavy footsteps, as if someone were walking around the upstairs of the house next door. The house had been empty for so long that it was hard to believe that someone could have moved in without her knowing. We asked her if she had seen anyone there recently, but she denied it. She said she hadn't dared to go near the house after the noises started. We decided to investigate. Mike and I entered the house next door, armed only with our flashlights and the radio to keep in touch with the dispatcher. The front door was unlocked, which was odd considering it had probably been closed since the last occupant left years ago. The house was in a state of disrepair. The floor creaked under our feet, and the air was heavy with a musty smell that made our stomachs turn. We walked slowly through the first floor, checking each room. Everything was in order, at least for an abandoned house. Old furniture covered in dust, cobwebs in the corners, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. But there was something in the air, a feeling I couldn't explain, as if we were being watched. We climbed the stairs, which groaned with every step, as if they were about to collapse. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. The first bedroom was empty except for an old bed and a wooden wardrobe, both covered in dust. The second bedroom had a broken window, through which fog seemed to be seeping, making the air even more humid and cold. But it was in the third bedroom that everything changed. As soon as we entered, the temperature dropped dramatically. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I could see that Mike was also uncomfortable. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, and it was moving, very slowly, back and forth. There was no wind, nothing to explain the movement. We shined our flashlights on the chair, hoping to see some sign of how this was happening, but there was nothing. The room was empty. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, shuffling, as if someone were walking down the hallway behind us. We turned around immediately, shining our flashlights, but the hallway was empty. The sound kept coming, getting closer, louder and louder, until it seemed to be only a few feet away. Mike whispered my name, his voice shaking, and I could see the sweat running down his face. He was a tough man, hard to scare, but at that moment, he was terrified. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We stood there, motionless, waiting for something to happen, but nothing. Just silence and the feeling that something or someone was very close to us. We decided it was time to get out of there. We ran down the stairs as fast as we could without running, trying to stay calm. When we got to the front door, it was closed, even though we were sure it would be. We left it open. Mike tried the doorknob, but it seemed locked from the inside. There was no key, and no way to open it. That was when the rocking chair upstairs began to creak again, the sound echoing through the empty house. Our flashlights began to flicker, flickering, and then going out completely. We were left in the dark, with only the sound of our own rapid heartbeat and the creaking of the chair. I can't say how long we stood like that, maybe seconds, maybe minutes. But then, as if some invisible force were at work, the door swung open by itself. We ran outside, panting, and found Mrs. Perkins in the driveway of her house, looking at us with an expression that was a mix of relief and fear. She didn't ask what had happened, and we didn't say anything. We just drove away, back to the police station, in silence. The next day, I went back to the scene, this time with a larger team. We searched the house from top to bottom, but found nothing. No explanation for the sounds, the rocking chair, the door that locked itself. The house was sealed off and, as far as I know, remains empty to this day. This experience left a deep impression on me. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or the supernatural, but after that night, I had to reconsider. There are things in this world that simply cannot be explained. And sometimes, they happen on the quietest nights, when we least expect them. Here's another story. From another cop. Beware of the supernatural. My name is Daniel Cooper, and I've been a cop for 12 years. I've worked in a few different cities, but it was in a small town in the backwoods of Texas called Grover's Mill that I had the most inexplicable experience of my life. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always thought everything had a logical explanation. But after that night, my outlook on the world changed forever. It was a Friday night, and I was on patrol alone. My partner, Joe Parker, had taken the day off to visit his family. Since Grover's Mill is a small town, there wasn't much to do other than drive through the dark, quiet streets. The clock was ticking just after midnight when I got a call from dispatch. The operator told me that a woman named Laura Mitchell had called 911 saying she saw someone on the property of the old train station, which had been in disuse for decades. The station was on the outskirts of town, an area that no one frequented anymore. Since the last train had passed through, the place had been virtually abandoned and had become a hub for urban legends and spooky stories. I arrived at the station around midnight. The station building was an imposing structure built in the early 1900s. The windows were broken, and the paint, once a vibrant red, was peeling away, revealing the brick beneath. The place was shrouded in near-total darkness, except for the faint moonlight that barely pierced through the heavy clouds. I got out of the train, armed with my flashlight and radio, and began to survey the perimeter. There was no sign of anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched was undeniable. As I walked toward the main entrance, I heard a sound that sounded like a whisper coming from inside the building. I paused for a moment, trying to identify the source of the sound, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I decided to enter the station. The main hall was spacious, but completely empty, except for a few old benches and pieces of wood scattered across the floor. The air was heavy, with a musty, dusty smell that seemed to permeate everything. My flashlight could only illuminate a few feet ahead, and each step I took echoed off the walls, adding to the feeling of isolation. As I explored the room, something caught my eye. On the opposite wall was a large mirror that seemed out of place in such a dilapidated space. It was clean, without a single trace of dust or dirt, as if someone had just polished it. I moved closer to take a closer look, and that was when the lights from my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if a draft of cold air had passed over me. I looked into the mirror and, for a brief moment, I saw something that left me paralyzed. Reflected in it was a figure with its back turned, dressed in a long coat, standing right behind me. I turned around instantly, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The hall was empty, just as it had been when I had entered. The sight left me disconcerted, but I had to keep going. I knew the mind could play tricks, especially in places like this. I decided to move on, entering one of the rooms behind the main hall. It was an old office, with furniture covered in white sheets and piles of documents scattered across the floor. Nothing looked like it had been disturbed in years. As I searched the room, the radio on my waistband emitted a loud hiss, making me jump in fright. The operator called my name, saying that he had received another call, this time from Mrs. Mitchell herself, saying that she saw lights inside the station. This took me by surprise, since I was inside and had not turned on any lights other than my flashlight. I asked dispatch if there were any other patrol cars in the area, but they confirmed that I was the only officer on duty that night. This meant that either someone was playing a prank on me, or something very strange was going on. I decided to go back to the main hall to check, but when I got there, the mirror was cracked, with a large fissure in the center that had not been there before. The whisper I had heard before came back, but this time it was clearer, more insistent. It seemed to come from every direction, as if the walls were whispering my name. I tried to remain calm and decided to leave the building. The feeling of imminent danger was too strong to ignore. When I reached the front door, it was closed. And no matter how hard I tried, the doorknob wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside, in a way that didn't make sense. I started looking for another way out, and that's when I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, echoing down the hallway I had just left. The sound got closer and closer, and I could feel my heart beating faster. Finally, I found a window that was still intact, and with one blow, I managed to break it. I quickly climbed up and threw myself out, landing on the damp grass outside the station. I got up and ran to the police car, without looking back. I reported what had happened to the operator, but I omitted certain details. I knew that if I said I saw a figure in the mirror or heard whispers calling my name, no one would believe me. The next morning, I returned to the scene with Joe and 2 other officers. We searched the station, but found nothing unusual, except for the crack in the mirror, which was still there. We never found out who, or what, was there that night. Since then, the station has been completely abandoned, and rumor has it that the city wants to demolish the place. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt. Something or someone is still there, trapped in that place forgotten by time. And although I never return to the station at night, that experience remains with me, reminding me that there are things in the world we simply cannot explain.